Greetings, fellow tarot travelers. Tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards, I will now lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch. And now we're going to talk about the Philippines. 100,000 people have been killed and many more dislocated by separatist fighting between Islamic revolutionaries and Catholic nationalist concerns in Muslim-dominated Mindanao. A Catholic church was recently bombed in Jolo during Sunday Mass, with a secondary bomb exploding, killing and maiming police and paramedic assistants after the first explosion. This bombing occurred where a recent vote passed for a self-governing referendum in Muslim-dominated Mindanao, which includes Jolo, to establish a new self-governed region called Bangsamoro. Jolo rejected this referendum, but the region will be independent because the referendum did indeed pass regionally. There are many Muslim separatist groups that have caused terrorism in the past, but most eyes are watching the Abu Sayyaf groups, which have pledged allegiance to ISIS. This act of terrorism, done not to civilians, nor to government, nor to military, was specifically targeting Catholicism. This act of terrorism parallels the opening salvo in East Timor, where thousands of Christians were slaughtered during its bloody Muslim regional takeover. In this case, however, the Muslims already won their independent regional status, but still seek to genocide Catholics for religious purification purposes. This act is also not unlike what Syrian Christians have suffered under ISIS, what Lebanese Christians have suffered under Hezbollah, what Chaldean Christians have suffered in Iran, and what Coptic Christians suffer regularly in Egypt. Fundamentalist Muslims want a religious holy war, and now they bomb a Catholic church in the Philippines to drive that message home to the residents of Jolo who would dare not to vote for the referendum. The terrorists also want to undermine government authority and destabilize the region to turn it into a fundamentalist region under an ISIS flag. Will Asia be the next breeding ground for ISIS ideology? Will Jolo be ethnically cleansed by militant Muslims? Is this the beginning of a Muslim-Catholic war? Will mosques and churches be bombed and burned? Will atheists sell both sides weapons? Will Muslims and Catholics from other countries join the war in Jolo that may erupt? Will the Catholic-dominated nation of the Philippines send in troops and ethnically cleanse the region of Muslims? Well, these are all very, very big questions, and we don't have answers. And when we have questions and no answers to be found, it's appropriate to turn to the cards and see what they have to say, because they'll always tell us something. In this instance, I'm going to be using Fournier's Poker Edition of Baraja cards. Now, Baraja cards, as you've probably seen in the Venezuela discussions I've had and readings I've had on my account, are cards used largely in Spain, Central and South America, but the Spanish colonized in the Philippines. In fact, the language spoken in the Philippines has many Spanish words in it. And in the Philippines, the Baraja cards are used to play cards. And so this is what we will use to ask, what is the fate of Mindanao? And is this going to be feeding into a larger Catholic-Muslim conflict? This conflict has been brewing for a long time in that region, and it just doesn't seem to abate. And you would think that after winning their referendum, that somehow there would be peace. What a strange thing to do after winning an election victory. So we shuffle the cards, cut the cards. And now let us see what the cards have to say. Let's get the cards in the picture here. All right. And the first card is the Jack of Coins. Now with this deck, it goes from ace to 10. Most Baraja decks only go to 9, and the numerology is very different for reading cards. But this one can be read very much like a tarot deck. The second card is the Two of Coins. I'm going to have to move the cards over a bit here to get the third card. And the third card is the Queen of Swords. Well, this is a very interesting layout of cards. You know, with the Baraja cards, we don't have the higher arcana cards. We only have the lower cards. So what speaks to be the higher level of consciousness, or the big decision makers, the empowered cards, those are the court cards. And in this reading, we have 2 court cards separated by the Two of Coins. Now, in general, what that speaks of is the Two of Coins always speaks of duality. It's a dualism, 2 people, 2 sides, 2 events. In this case, it's going to be the Catholics and the Muslims. And this is at the root of the conflict. And here we have 2 court cards, the Jack of Coins, and that would probably in this instance be the Muslims. And the reason why the Jack of Coins, which is a lesser card, would be the Muslims is because the country of the Philippines is mostly Catholic. It has Muslims in the south and Muslim-dominated regions, but the nation as a whole is dominated by Catholicism. And so then we can reckon that this card would represent the government at the capital of the Philippines and would represent the Catholic interests involved. So here we have both sides sort of with the body language going away from the center, and yet their eyes are both looking at the center. Very interesting, because the body language belies the actual concentration and focus. So I would say that both the Catholics and the Muslims are ready for a conflict, but only the Catholics are armed. The Muslims may have money for arms, but they're not as well armed as the Catholics. The Catholics that run the Philippines and that really own the government of the Philippines are in charge. They're on the horse. They're in the superior position in terms of government, which is riding the horse. They have superior arms, which is the carrying of the sword. It's the queen, so this represents the mother church, and which connects the Philippines to all of Catholicism. And there's an old saying, how many troops does the Pope have? I mean, we'd have to include in that countries like Romania, and we'd have to have Central America, South America, a huge Catholic contingency in Canada, in America. The Pope has a lot of troops. And the Catholic Church in the Philippines is very strong. A jack would be more like terrorism. It's someone who's on the feet close to the ground, and in fact, the coin could be the placing of the bomb. So I think that this pictograph speaks to the dilemma without giving us any resolution. It does show that the Catholics are in charge and have the upper hand, but it doesn't tell us how this whole thing will resolve. So to know how it resolves, I think we need to go to the center card, which speaks of the fundamental duality. And let's put out some significators. Above we have the 7 of clubs. Here, let me hold it up so we can all see before I tuck it away. Now the 7 of clubs, here I want to get it straight. The 7 of clubs, well, first of all, as a club, it's a masculine card. Clubs and swords tend to point to militarism and conflict in general, because they're the masculine cards. And the 7 of clubs is a card that has to do with, well, it has to do with individuality and creating your own groundwork from where you can operate. But it has many more interpretations besides that. and below is the ace of swords. The aces represent the entire suit of swords. If it was an ace of clubs, it'd be the entire suit of clubs. So the aces are the most profound of all. As an example, the Queen of Swords, which is a woman and represents the church ultimately, because the Catholic Church views the church as the mother to all, as the Virgin Mother, which is very much what the Queen of Swords is. But the Ace of Swords would be a proclamation of war, or it could be the arsenal from which they draw their armaments to fight the war, or it could be the actual military contingency of troops being sent with tanks. And so the Queen is actually looking down, if you look at her eyes more carefully, whereas the Jack is looking across at the dualism. So whereas the Muslims are looking at the duality, it's not fair. They're Muslims versus Catholics, and we have to enter in a war because they're concerned with the duality. The Queen is looking down at the armaments, counting the bullets, realizing that victory's at hand. And the actual conflict itself is rooted in the Seven of Clubs. I think the Seven of Clubs speaks of the actual fighting that can occur between the two sides. And being clubs rather than swords, remember this sword is sheathed and it's below. But this one has to do with what is above, and so it has to deal with the idealism of a warrior theology that Islam decries, but also Catholicism has aspects of warrior theology. You know, there is a certain amount of demagogics involved with the Seven of Clubs. I would say that looking at these cards, that the Philippines is not entering into a time of peace, that the bombing of this church did get noticed. And I would say that there is a large grouping in the capital willing to take arms against the Muslims, that the passing of the referendum was somehow a gift to the Muslims, but because of their behavior, I think that the president of the Philippines may go in there and want to clear out all of the ISIS people, and we could see some conflict erupt. I don't think the story is over. I don't think the last chapter is written. And I think that the dualism of the two sides is here written in the cards. From my estimation, the Muslims made a very big tactical error in doing this. They got a short-term victory, and they're going to pay the price in the long term. And that would be my estimation based on what the cards are saying.